But what changed in your pricing, or at least what made you reconsider your current pricing?
Um, I think I always knew the pricing was fairly low. It was more trying to test it, and then we've had a few clients, so I realized like I could raise the price at some point.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I don't know like if there was a specific moment per se, but
Yep.
I think the plan was always to raise the pricing at some point. But after having a few clients, I felt
Yeah.
more confident, I guess, in raising that. So,
How did you find that experience? Did you notice anything different when you changed pricing?
um, not yet, but I think I think there was a long time period in between the pricing, so it was not like a shock. It's not like there were some customers that knew the old pricing
Yep.
and then saw the new pricing was like, oh wow, this is too much. So
Yeah.
I think that is kind of a benefit. So
Mhm. For new customers, did you find that it was just as pretty much as similar as before when it came to closing them, or was it harder to close them, or did it seem like they were more willing to pay? I don't know, or not enough data as well.
it didn't really change, to be honest. I think the lower pricing
Yeah.
was more frustrating than the higher pricing because the higher pricing, I don't mind so much adjusting the pricing a bit, but
Yep.
before when I knew I was, way below and people were still saying it was too much, then I was like, well, okay, I know this is really low and you're trying to
Yeah.
pay close to nothing. So that was a little bit more frustrating for sure.
True. Good point.
But I think
Um.
I think of the 5 clients we've had, there was only like one client that really debated the pricing, but with all the others, it was not a huge issue. So,
Cool. Yeah. I think that also boils down to kind of speaking to who is your ideal customer and whether or not you want to waste time with those who are over negotiating on certain things as well. But yes, definitely having a higher price ceiling gives you a lot more wiggle room around negotiation too.
mm,
So curious to get your thoughts on this. Let's say if you look at this question here, you see a lot of companies tend to do that, 299 type of pricing, where the psychology is quite clear. They're doing it because 299 is perceived as being cheaper than 300, although it's effectively more or less the same price. Which way do you lean? Do you think it's right to do 299, or do you think it's right to do the 300?
um, I think we'd probably do the 299 approach just because I know the psychology of it, but
Yeah.
I don't usually do 299 exact because it
Yeah.
always feels kind of like Walmart. So I do maybe 280 or
Yeah.
290 or something like that.
Yeah.
So it feels a little bit more natural and not just like clearly doing what you're saying. So,
Makes sense. Um, the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of people fall into the trap of focusing on biopsychology for the sake of biopsychology. So what I mean by that is, yes, the research is out there and it does say that 299 is perceived as cheaper than 300, so more likely people are willing to go for 299. But what a lot of people overlook is that your pricing can also possibly reflect your company values. So, for example, if you're trying to communicate that you're providing a service that is quality centric rather than value based. When I say value here, I'm using two terms of value. So one is your company value or your personal values, and then the other usage of value is being like it's affordable, it's a deal, it's a bargain kind of value, right? So the 299 gives you that deal bargain value kind of feel, and the 300 on the other hand, like if you're trying to communicate to people that you're not a company that is bargain centric, but you're more like quality focused, then it's absolutely okay to actually charge more. And by charging more, maybe it's not just like the difference between 299 and 300. It might be even charging deliberately quite a bit more, maybe going up to like $1,000 or even more than that as well. So when you think about pricing, and not just pricing, I think any sort of decision you're making with your business, I strongly encourage you to think about what are your company values, and this usually stems from your personal values, because a lot of people don't realize that pros and cons effectively are different for each person. My pros and cons might be different compared to yours, and this is usually it stems from your company values. And having good alignment on company values also makes it a lot easier for you and your employees or people you bring on board as co-founders to make decisions that align with the business, because it's not just about the why or the mission of the company, but also you want to make sure that you're working with people who you trust, and the trust is really stems from them having the same ethos and ethics behind how they execute on the business. So if they share the same values, then they kind of share the same way of doing business, and you know that they're not going to do everything just for the sake of doing it, and at the expense of sacrificing some company values or things that you don't want them to be doing, right? So number one, yeah, just kind of think about how does company values or your brand value play into pricing. Maybe it's not going to be a big piece, but if it is, then you might want to consider that. And then number two, I talked about goals. So whether or not you're focusing on profitability or are you prioritizing growth. Again, no wrong or right answer, but just make sure that you are intentional or purposeful going into it.
I guess I'm curious if you can explain what, in your perspective, growth means, because for us, they kind of go hand in hand in the sense of, the more customers we have, the
Yes.
more people we have to recruit. So they kind of ideally would be aligned, if that makes sense.
Yep. I'll give you a few different kind of scenarios. So one is, for example, is you might say that you're a high touch service, and to that end, you would charge a much higher amount, and that will give you the kind of attention and quality to spend with your clients that you bring on board. So you can price a lot higher, and there, when I talk about growth, it might allow you as a company to hire people to really service this client with a good level of quality. But on the other hand, this might mean that you might grow more slowly in terms of getting a number of customers. Might or might not, really depends, right? So for example, maybe it might be a slower sales cycle. It might be a bit harder to close clients. It might be more difficult for people to come on board. But at the same time, like strategically, you could say, okay, maybe it's because I'm giving them such a level of care that they will, on the other side of the picture, give really good reviews, give good testimonials, and refer other people as well. So it could lead to growth, but the growth might be more linear rather than looking at, okay, I'm going to have lower pricing, and that might make it easier and quicker for me to close sales. And then I can have more people in my portfolio. And there, on that case, then you might say, oh, because I have more case studies or more testimonials, even though the quality of care, I don't mean to say that you have to sacrifice on quality of care. You might still be able to give them really good attention, but maybe it's just a different level of attention. Maybe the packages that you work with them are smaller. Maybe it's more, I'd say less customized. Maybe it's more like templated, where you say like, okay, this is what we'll do, and it's pretty much the same for every company. So it's easier for you to also scale in terms of servicing more companies, but at the same time, not spending as much time with them because they're not paying you as much. Make sense? So that could be one of the playthroughs around like growth. On the other hand, like let's say if you end up moving more towards let's say a software type of route, or if you have a more templated package, then again you could see the same thing where it's maybe, let's say if you look at software companies, some of them they actually even operate at a loss. In turn, they usually rely on funding from either investors or capital from, let's say, banks or loans, and they use that to bring in more manpower, hire people, acquire more customers, even if those customers that they bring in are kind of a loss driver for them. So it really depends on how you want to operate. Another example I can think of is when I was working at Spring, a lot of the events that we were running, so we would run workshops, we would run events, they would honestly probably be more of a loss driver, if anything. So events take up a lot of time. They take up anywhere from, like, even what I'm doing right now. Most of my workshops an hour long, and if I only have like one person attending, in theory, it's a loss driver because I'm wasting my time. But at the same time, if you view it as instead of this is pure profit driven, if you think about what is the long-term goal of doing these activities, if you see it as, let's say, this is my marketing budget, as opposed to this is my revenue generating activity. If this is part of my marketing activity, then it makes sense that it's going to cost you money. It makes sense that it's not actually going to give you revenue, but on the other side, it's going to actually help you get in front of people, build relationships, that kind of thing. Make sense? So yeah, I mean, the basic point is those are some tips to start, but at the end of the day, you don't have to be too creative in pricing. The good news is just start with what is already out there. And when I say what is already out there, there are usually two things that you look at, and we'll go into those. So one is what are your competitors charging, or what are similar service costing? And then number two is what is the customer's expectation? So what do people expect to pay for this? And when I say expect, it might mean, again, how do they compare you to other services that they're using versus what do they see in terms of the value of your product or service? Make sense? So I would say as homework, this would be a pretty good thing to start if you haven't already done this before, is go out and find a similar competitor. And when I say competitor, it doesn't have to be direct competitor. That means you don't have to be doing the exact same thing that you're doing, but let's say some other company that services the HR department. Maybe it could be a payroll service. Maybe it could be someone who organizes corporate events. Maybe it could be someone who does team building activities. I don't know. But go out and mystery shop them and see how do they charge. What kind of packages do they use? Do they just bill by the hour? Do they have a package? Do they what's the range? Is it $1,000 a workshop? Is it free to start? How do they do it? So try this out, because what you will often find is you want to see what channels are they using? How do they get in front of that customer? Number two, what do they say? What language? How do they convince someone to jump on a call with them, for example? What is the process or the sales flow? So a lot of that you can actually copy and paste. And then same with the pricing model as well. So, but by doing this, by taking this approach, then you're basically pricing based on what the current marketplace looks like. Make sense? And then on the other side of the picture, if you haven't already done customer discovery, then again, or even if you have, this is a good time to come back to your existing customers and just kind of ask them some questions. You want to understand more on the pricing side of things as opposed to the problem solution fit. Because I'm assuming in your case, especially because you've already operated your business for quite a while, it's less about figuring out and validating the problem and the solution at this point, but this is kind of the round two. So you want to understand, are you trying to go after the premium or exclusive market? Or are you trying to go after smaller companies? Or are you trying to go after nonprofits? What do they care about? What is acceptable for them? What is kind of more on the expensive range, and what is way too much for them to even consider? Usually what you'll find is you want to be in a situation where whatever price you throw out to your customer, you don't get an immediate yes. So what I mean by that is if it's too easy to close a customer, you're probably underpricing. Again, if it's too hard to close a customer, maybe you're overpricing. You might be overpricing, or you might be going after the wrong type of customer. So maybe you're actually going after small companies when instead at the higher price range, you should be going after, let's say, US-based companies that are larger size. I don't know. So that's one thing to kind of try to figure out. What are their expectations on how much they should be paying for the service? Because sometimes you might even find a situation where maybe a lot of people hesitate to sign up because you are priced too low. And by pricing too low, they perceive you as a kind of inferior quality service. So that could be happening as well. Who knows? And then the second thing is understanding how do they like to pay. So what I mean by how do they like to pay is, do they normally want to pay before and after an event? How would they typically pay? Do they pay in installments? Do they pay upfront? Is it done as check? Is it done as e-transfer? That kind of stuff. So it sounds very basic, but just understanding what they expect can help you, because some people don't consider certain things. You might not consider, maybe they actually prefer installment payments because that brings down their processing fees. I don't know. Any questions so far in terms of starting with how we could figure out what the market currently charges?
No, makes sense.
The next thing to think about as well is, are you currently structuring your pricing primarily from a cost perspective? So what I mean by cost perspective is, I see this mostly with service providers, and you would fall under that bucket as well. These people will think, oh, I have a project. How much time is it going to cost me? How much materials, how many hours of manpower do I put towards this project? And they tend to build a quote from that. So it's very cost centric. The challenge I find with cost-based pricing is sometimes the value that you can give to your client is not proportional to the cost that you put into a project. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you one example. So there was a recycling company that I worked with. They were actually providing the service where they would go to events, music festivals, and they would help people with managing their recycling bins. And what they would do is they would actually quote based on, let's say, how long is the event, how big is the venue, and from there they would come up with a price. And what they were finding is, let's say for one event, let's say you have a 300-person attendee event, and it's running from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. It's a 3-hour event and 300 people. And they have another version of an event where it's same 3 hours long, but it's a much bigger event. Let's say it's 500 people. But the venue size is about the same, and the number of bins that they're using is about the same. Then they were noticing that their pricing was actually not scaling according to that. So they actually encouraged them to shift more towards value-based pricing, where they would actually price based on number of attendees that were coming to the event, because the volume of recycling that they were processing based on number of attendees would be a lot higher, right? So it's not just about the number of bins versus the how many hours versus how many employees you have to be at the site to manage it, but it also amounts to how much value are you creating for that event organizer. Make sense? So try to think about, what is the value that I'm creating for my customer? And usually on the value creation side, a good questions that you ask yourself include things like, how much time am I saving my client? How much money am I saving them? Or how much more money am I helping them earn? And there are some rough kind of rule of thumbs that you can use to estimate that. But before I jump into that, I'll give you another example. Let's say if you're running a workshop. If you're running a workshop with an audience of 100 with a small unknown company, versus if you're running a workshop with the same number, also an audience of 100, but with a big company like EA or Nike. It kind of makes sense that you should be charging EA or Nike a lot more, even though it's the same workshop, same duration, same number of attendees, but you know that that company is a much bigger company. You know that they have a much larger budget for this type of workshops as well. Make sense? So what is the value that you're creating for them? Because if they're a higher tier customer or bigger brand, the impact of what you're delivering with them in your workshop might actually resonate more throughout their company and actually end up helping them, let's say, maybe make more money, improve their employee retention more, that kind of stuff. Make sense? So I talked about this tree: making more money, save time. These are typically the 3 basic ways to add value to a customer. If you are able to try to estimate some of these, the rough rule of thumb is, if you can help them make more money, generally you're looking at charging them about 10 to 20% of the additional income that you can bring them. If you can help them save money, it's usually about 10 to 15% of their annual savings. If you can help them save time, that's a bit trickier. You need to try to estimate what your time is worth. So for example, if you, let's say, know that a HR manager typically spends 5 hours a month doing X, Y, and Z, and each hour they typically, their hourly rate is about $200 per hour, then you can say, okay, from there, I'm going to charge you 10% of that missed opportunity that you could have if you had the time for yourself. Make sense? So again, some of these are very rough rule of thumbs, but it just gets you thinking on, like, what are you trying to price around? I want to say a quick word of this. It might not apply to you as much, but I think it might be interesting if you can find a way to work this into pricing as well. Is nowadays in the software side, I think I talked about this yesterday, is usage-based pricing is growing in popularity. So this is again where it speaks back to value-based pricing versus cost. You're thinking about how much value am I adding to a customer? The more a customer uses my product or service, in theory, it means that they're getting more value out of me. Therefore, I should be justified in charging them more. Make sense? Let me change my share screen just to show you a calculator that I built. So this is more relevant to you because you do service type kind of events, you do very customized quotations. So for my case, for example, this is a calculator that I use for my own business. And to be honest, I don't use them for every single project because some of times I kind of have a rough sense because I've used this so many times already that I can estimate, and it's quite accurate if I go back in here and plug in the numbers as well. But having something like this to start might help for a few reasons. So one is, if you're growing to a position where eventually you bring on other people into your company to help with closing products, then you want to be able to give them some level of autonomy around speaking to customers and coming up with a price. So they don't always have to bring you into a sales conversation. Make sense? So to do that, then you would have to have some calculator or some tool for them to plug in numbers so that whatever they estimate is going to be more or less on par with what you would estimate as well. So that's one reason why you might want this. And then another reason why you might want this is just to kind of keep yourself in check so that you don't end up over discounting. Because I find a lot of us tend to have a lot of doubts about our own value, and we tend to underprice because we find that people are willing to push back, people are willing to negotiate, then we kind of go down on the price as well. So here, this kind of helps you understand like where is your ceiling, what's your room for negotiation, and how you want to price. So in my case, for my calculator, every project that I have, one of the factors that I input is I consider how desirable is the project. And desirability here, what factors into that includes, if I get this client, what's the potential for future projects? How might it influence my ability to get other clients, because maybe I could use them as case study. How much do I like them? Do they align with my values? Do I feel like they're an exciting company to work with? That all factors into desirability. So it's a bit of a big umbrella. But if I find that, let's say if I don't really want to work with this client, then they're low desirability. Then I might mark up my pricing a bit more. So that's an example of how you might factor in some of these kind of calculations. And then the other thing that I look at is, how would this project affect my availability? Do I think it's going to be something that will require, let's say, part-time engagement every week? Is it going to be something that will need like 40 hours every week? So there's going to be a factor on that as well. How long is this project going to be? Is it a short project? Is it a longer project? Again, this is more like intensity, and this is more duration. And then, is it an urgent project? Is it something that they're doing a rush project for? And I might mark it up if they have certain levels of expectations around how quickly things need to be delivered. And then complexity. Is it a really difficult project? Do I really need to be extra creative with certain things? Might I need to bring in other people to help? Is it going to be something that requires a lot of brain power? Is it something that's really basic? So again, there's some variables over there. So based on some of these things, you can put in your calculations after you selected this criteria, and it'll help you calculate what it might look like. So for example, I can select over here, ability of interest, like this is a project that they could do themselves, but maybe they need strategic advice. Or maybe it's out of their scope, right? And then when I select that, it changes the value, and then it will change the variable, and that will in turn affect the pricing as well. What's the scope? Is it just grant implementation? Is it complex coordination, project management? What are the deliverables that they want? So I can put in these things, I can change my calculator, and it'll give me a different output. Value creation, again, this is if you can estimate, what kind of value creation you're giving to them. If I say like, oh, I could probably bring in this client more than, let's say, 10,000 a month. If I try to charge them 10% of that, I can roll into pricing $1,000 more. Make sense? If I can help them save time, what do I think their time's worth? What's the multiplier? That kind of stuff. If I'm saving costs for them, again, same thing. So you might use a complex calculator like this. It might even be more robust depending on what you need. If you're curious, I'll show you just another tool that we built for another client. Actually, this is not the more complex version of it. I'll bring that one. So there's this other client that was looking to have both value-based and cost-based pricing in their pricing model, but they price like really big projects, like $1 million projects, $500,000 projects. So let me see what their calculator looks like. But yeah, you can see here they have like different consultants they might bring into a project. If they work with multiple people, they have different rates. They also have different currencies because they have they outsource their project to different consultants in different places. Different level of competency for different talent that they bring on. Is it senior level, mid-level, junior level?
I think for me, like long term, probably the pricing would be more if it's entry versus mid-level talent that I'm trying to fill, because in terms of the value-based, like a mid-level or senior level is going to be more valuable for them. And
yeah.
I think that's recruitment tends to do that. I mean, I think I'm maybe a bit abnormal because most recruiters focus more on the executive or senior level, and I'm more focused on entry to mid-level. So it's not, it's a little bit, how do you say, lower value for them to some extent. But I think I try to, I'm working on creating the awareness of like, well, even if you have interns, if you create a good internship program, then you can have those employee for future roles that you're trying to fill, and you don't have to do as much training. So you're actually saving money by having interns rather than trying to find someone new and not knowing how well they'll fit in the role. So
yeah, like I would say like every company will have a different priority in terms of how they view junior and mid-level talent. Larger companies might be willing to invest a lot more in that because for them they see it as more long-term planning, because these interns would eventually grow into senior management in the future. So again, like how you price, there's no right or wrong way, but I think this is where the interesting part comes in. You don't have to be overcomplicated with pricing. Like I've showed you some really complicated calculators on one end, but on the same side, you could have very simple pricing and you can just tweak and test those and see how does that affect how difficult it is for you to acquire customers, how long a customer stays with you. So I'll show you that in a second. So on the optimization side, I'm going to assume, let's say if you have a simple model where you price primarily based on the level of talent or based on the number of talent that you're bringing into them, then usually if your pricing model is simple, it's a lot easier to try to figure out what is the right price. If you have complex pricing models, you have to do a lot more experiments to figure out if you're at the right number. But usually on a very basic level, the higher the price, it affects two things. The higher price, number one, is it makes it harder for you to get a customer, because higher your price, you usually need more time with a client in order to convince them, in order for them to purchase your product or service. So your cost goes up, customer acquisition cost, in terms of it increases your sales cycle. Maybe you need to spend more time marketing. Maybe you need to do more events with them before they're willing to convert, that kind of stuff. And then the second thing is the higher your price, the higher your churn as well. So the churn or the lifetime value means that your customers will stay with you for a shorter period of time, or they might not use your product or service as often because they know that it's really expensive. Make sense? So what you want to do as you play around with pricing is you want to keep a close eye on both your customer acquisition cost and your lifetime value. and you want to understand like what goes into this metrics, and can you measure it? Can you track it against time to see how your changes in pricing are affecting these two things? So one example I give you is there was this company, again, it's a Vancouver-based company. They run this company called My Best Helper, and it's basically a service that connects parents with nannies and babysitters. So what they did is when they started for their platform, they would charge babysitters, I think $10 a month to be in their platform. And over time, they played around and tweaked their pricing, and they were increasing pricing, and they were able to increase pricing from $10 a month all the way to $80 a month for babysitters. That's an 8x increase. And what they saw in terms of how that affected both churn and customer lifetime value is when they were charging $10 a month, a babysitter would be on average on their platform for about 6 months. And anything more than 6 months was usually quite hard, because in general, most people don't do caregiving or babysitting as a full-time job, and they are usually doing it as something on the interim before they move on to something else. So on average, $10 a month times 6 months, lifetime value of a customer is $60. They increased up to $80 a month. That did cause a lot of the customers to leave more quickly. So they found that lifetime value of the customer, or at least the churn, went down to 3 months instead of 6 months. But if you think about it, 3 months times 80, that's $240 per customer, as opposed to $60 per customer. So negative churn isn't always bad if it comes with a higher upside in terms of the lifetime value of a customer. So again, like this could be viewed as the wrong approach depending on what you're prioritizing with your company. If you see this as something that's concerning because the negative churn will actually affect how your company is growing as a platform, then maybe it's not the right approach. But if you're purely focusing on like making the numbers work, then maybe this might be a better approach. So what I would normally encourage is, as you play around with pricing, you want to always keep track on, what is your customer life cycle? How long do they stay with you? How many projects on average do they do with you, right? And that in turn is going to affect the lifetime value. So for example, $50 life cycle, 6 months, lifetime value of your customer is $300. And then you're looking at cost of acquisition as well. This one is a bit harder to calculate. For CAC, the main inputs that go into it include, if you're spending money on marketing, how much are you spending in terms of your marketing budget? How many hours are you spending with a customer? That also affects your customer acquisition costs, because in theory, the more time you spend with a customer, that time is worth money as well, right? So
what's the acronyms? LTV, CAC? You might have mentioned.
Yeah, LTV is lifetime value. And then CAC is the customer acquisition costs. Yeah. So you don't have to get it perfect, but the key goal is to be consistent. So if you use this specific formula for CAC, then just make sure it's applied the same across all of your pricing models. Make sense? So I'll give you one basic example of CAC. So you might say, this month I spent $60 on ads for my events. I ran 2 workshops this month, and therefore my total quote unquote CAC is, let's say, $200. That's a rough number. And I acquired 5 customers. So 5 divided by $200, that means that each customer costs you $50 to acquire. No, sorry. I don't have a calculator, but I think you get a point. So you're trying to break down how much you think it costs for you to acquire each customer based on the number of spend that you put into this type of activities. Make sense? Lifetime value, are you clear on that? So that's usually based on how much you price versus how many occurrences of payment you get from the customer. So maybe that's based on how many projects, or based in how many months do they stay with you if you're doing subscription, and that gives you your lifetime value number. So if your price is $100, if they stay with you for 6 months, then the lifetime value is $600. So the sweet spot is you want to aim for this thing called the LTV CAC ratio. So what you basically do is you take the lifetime value and you divide it by cost of acquisition, and the higher the number, the better. Because it means that, at this price, $200, customers stayed with you for 5 months, you made $1,000 off the customer, and it only costs you $60 to get the customer. So the bigger this number, it means that that's the most profitable range that you want to be in. Because maybe as you go higher, sure, you may be making more money off the customer, but it also costs you a lot more to get the customer, and maybe it does make sense. Cool. Discounting. So if you have to go there because people are negotiating with you, my recommendation is to focus on value add rather than just reducing the pricing. And the reason why is because when you are resorting to reducing pricing, immediately you are also reducing the perceived value of your product or service. Make sense? So how do you increase value then is you talk about what else do they want? What else are they interested in? How can you give them some freebies? Maybe it's other things like upselling, giving them a better package. Maybe it might be being more flexible with payment terms. You might say, oh, if you can't afford this, then maybe you can break this down in three chunks. Maybe you do a payment before the project, one in the middle of the project, and one at the end if you see some results, that kind of stuff. So think about how you can be flexible around that. Maybe there is some risk versus reward sacrifice that you can take. If they can't pay you X amount of dollars, maybe they can give you something else like revenue share. Maybe they can give you some equity. Maybe you can bundle some offerings, that kind of stuff. Another example of an interesting way of pricing is, let's say if do you do packages, or do you do quote based on every single project?
At the moment we do fixed amounts or pricing, but we're in the process of adjusting the pricing, so that's why this is good time to take this webinar.
So if you do fixed, then is it usually based on like package A includes 2 events, 1 workshop, that kind of stuff? Is it based on quantity like that?
It's based on like per hire. I mean our
Okay.
main service, so like X amount of dollars per hire. Maybe in the future we'll like do adjust the rate depending on, say, if they want to fill 3 roles versus 1, but at the moment we haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Okay. I'm just thinking how this might apply to you. Maybe I'll give you an example first and I'll come back to that. So one example of reduced pricing is, let's say, for example, if you have let's say $100 package, and that gives you 10 hours of service for your client. What you might do is you might say, okay, for 20 hours of service, instead of paying $200, you only pay 180, and that's the discount that you get. An alternative way of doing that is, instead of reducing your pricing, you might say, for $200, you get 20 hours plus 3 extra hours. So you're not bringing down your price, but instead you're giving them more. So you might say, instead of having a lower price and us giving you less hires, we'll give you more hires instead. So that's how you discount, but give them more value. Make sense? But only do this if it makes sense for your organization. Like if those extra hours or extra hires that you're giving them is going to cost you too much in terms of your labor, then it doesn't make sense. If you have the discount, usually you use percentages. This is more on the psychology side. If the discounts that you're giving are more than 100, then you want to use the actual value itself, the dollar value. If it's less than 100, then you use the percentage value. Just psychologically, it looks bigger that way. So it feels to them as if they're getting a better deal. Make sense? So that's all I have to say on pricing. I haven't really given a very straightforward answer on it, and I think a lot of it does apply to it depends on what you care about when you're pricing. So like I mentioned, what are your values? What are your goals? What does the market perceive? What does the market tolerate? What are the existing competitors pricing at? So it does require some amount of research on that part. And then from there, the optimization, then that's where you do some experimentation. You test and see, like if you price higher, does it make it harder for you to get customers? How much harder? how long do they continue using your product or services, that kind of stuff. So at your stage, because you're so early along, I'd say don't worry too much about getting pricing perfect. At the start, it's probably more like focus on that mystery shopping element, try to understand what do people expect, and that's probably a good place to start. So the other thing I want to talk about as well that relates to pricing is kind of on the growth side of things, which you asked about, like what exactly is growth. I think this will help you think about other ways to grow a business, because at the end of the day, yes, you can make more money by increasing pricing, but there are also more ways to increase revenue by getting more customers as well. So on the growth side, if you've read Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, have you read it? If you haven't, Eric Ries talks about three main engines of growth that almost every company will go through. So one is the paid engine of growth, which is more traditional marketing. There's the viral engine of growth, which is more about word of mouth referrals. And there's a sticky engine of growth, which is more about retention. So I'll talk about each three of those. On the paid engine, like doing ads, visual marketing, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, those kind of things, usually work best for products or services that are easy to understand and that are differentiated enough. So what I mean by that is, let's say if you go on LinkedIn and you start posting to promote your business, if you're in a situation where if you step out of your business and you step into your customer's shoes, if they are looking at your ad, if they don't understand how you're different from someone else who's running this type of events, then it's going to be very difficult to convince them. Make sense? So if it's more about experiencing something in order to see the value, then the paid engine of growth might not be your right channel. So I'll talk about the next channel, but the main takeaway with paid engine of growth is it works for like very visual products, things that are easy to see. It's very easily differentiated. People understand how you're different from all the other alternatives out there. On the other hand, if you are more, people need to try it in order to understand it kind of situation, maybe your solution is really innovative, maybe it's something that they're not aware of, maybe it's very customer service focused, then you want to rely more on this viral engine of growth. So viral is more alluding to word of mouth. And the idea here is, if you're relying on word of mouth, then you want to make sure that you're building specific processes into how you actually grow your business that help and encourage word of mouth. So for example, if every client that you work with, you might actually actively solicit testimonials at the end of the project, because you know that testimonials will help with word of mouth. You might have campaigns that, let's say with Dropbox, what they had for their campaign is, refer a friend and you get extra storage space and your friend gets extra storage space. Right? So you can actually build this into your actual campaigns, and it doesn't only always have to be like a marketing campaign where you say, hey, refer a friend and get an X amount of dollars gift card or X dollars in our product or services. So you can build it into how you actually acquire customers or work with the customers as well. Yeah, does this give you any ideas?
I mean, in terms of growth, in terms of customers, we mostly do direct outreach at the moment via email. But I think for us, what will be nice and what we're still kind of working on is like how to grow the talent pool, because I think that would be nice to have a bit more organic.
Yep.
Because it is a little bit, it ends up being a lot of work when we have a client and we need to fill a specific role and we have to, go through the process of finding talent. So kind of on one hand, we have to gain more clients for sure, but that I think at the moment, probably like the approaches you're mentioning aren't the best fit just yet. But in terms of growing the talent pool, I think especially the viral option probably could, make sense, like word of mouth. Like the community, I definitely have seen, we sometimes get like 10 new members just from one person mentioning the community. So that we've definitely seen the community has grown by word of mouth to some extent. So
Yeah. So if you're trying to focus on that word of mouth aspect, I'm saying be intentional with it. Don't just hope that it happens naturally. Like actually actively solicit and get your customers to do it. And it doesn't always have to be like, hey, always like write a testimonial for us. Can you refer clients to us? The kind of activity, but you can actually build it into the experience as well. So I'll give you one example that I can think of is there was
yeah,
this
we definitely do. We've gotten testimonials from 3 or 4 clients, and then
yeah.
Try to always ask for referrals. So we do that for sure.
Great. But not only that, like I can think of one example here is there used to be this technical school called Red Academy in Vancouver. I think they operated in Toronto as well. And what they would do is they had these company showcases. So what they would do for their students is every term or every semester, their students would be paired up with a company to do a community project. So how these community projects work is it's a term project based on what degree the students are taking. Let's say if they're taking a design course or if they're taking a web development course, then they go out and solicit from the community and say, hey, who needs a website done? Our students will help you build a website for free, and in turn, this gives them experience and it gives you something of value. And what they do at the end of the program is they have these showcase events where they actually have the students pitch what they have built for the company. And these things would actually help them bring in more companies for future projects. And in theory, these companies will hire their students as well. So that's kind of the value piece there. And they used it as a word of mouth thing because people will be curious to see what the students have built. So they've actually created this as public events where the students come, they pitch, they showcase what they've built, and then it's interesting. The companies attend as well, and they bring out like other companies that are not just the company that they've built the solution for would attend, and then they would see, oh, this is something that I would want for my business as well, and then they would apply for the next cohort. So it might be something like that, right? Like how can you encourage people to come in? Landmark Forum or even churches are a pretty good example. Like Landmark Forum, if you've heard of them, they seem a bit like a cult. And what's interesting is in their program, they have one day where they actually encourage attendees to bring outsiders, like their family members, their friends, to see and hear the Landmark experience, to see what transformation they've gone through. And by doing that, that actually creates that opportunity for that outsider to have a kind of a taste of what the experience is like without actually fully committing or paying for a program. So that's an example of actually encouraging and building in that virality into the actual offering. So that's the viral piece. And then on the other side, the sticky piece is more about thinking if you have, or assuming you have a fixed rate of growth in terms of acquisition, then another way to, of course, grow your business and revenue is just by getting more from your existing customers. So how can you get them to stay with you in terms of having more projects with you over time, continuing to use you over X number of years, that kind of stuff. So how can you increase that retention? How can you get them to come back? How can you get them to run more campaigns with you? The main thing you think about is if you're thinking about focusing on this in terms of retention, you not only want to get people to stay around longer with you, but you want to make sure that any existing customer that stays with you spends more with you. So what I mean by that is you're giving not only reduced churn, but you're actually doing what we call net negative churn. That means you're actually making more profit per customer. And this is usually done by upselling or cross-selling. So you might say like, oh, to an existing customer, you know what, you've worked with us for X number of years. We don't only have this package, but we have a higher package where we can do more for you. And if you upgrade them, then that you're actually getting more value out of the customer as well. Of course, like again, this is constrained by what you have in terms of what you can give them as a service. So you may over time decide that, oh, we're going to do more, we're going to have more offerings, we're going to do more for our customers. So you could, in theory, have, let's say, HR consulting service where you work with another company that provides extra stuff, or maybe you have a recruiting arm, or you have a payroll servicing arm. I don't know. Other things to think about when you're thinking about increasing revenue. So we talked about raising price, which is number 4. Obviously, increasing number of customers, that seems very straightforward, but I'll talk about some ideas around that as well. Increasing transaction size, so when they do buy from you, getting them to buy more, or increasing frequency of transaction. How often do they utilize your service? When it comes to increasing number of customers, here are a few things that you can play around or experiment with. So one is test your channels. So maybe right now you're running events. What other ways? Maybe it's approaching companies at job fairs, approaching companies at career fairs. Maybe it's going on LinkedIn. Maybe it's testing new channels like TikTok, Instagram, who knows? Expanding your target market. Maybe not only servicing Montreal, but you might say, oh, we're going to go after companies in Toronto, in Ottawa. I don't retargeting. So I talked about this yesterday, where you already have existing customers. How can you reduce that leak, get them back in the funnel, get them re-engaged, interested again? Referrals, we talked about. Thought leadership, so creating content, and then encouraging some sort of regulatory compliance if you're within that scope. Probably doesn't apply to you, but I've seen some companies try to do that to some degree of effectiveness. Like one company here in Vancouver, they're trying to get companies to adopt a mindset around green buildings that doesn't only account for the sustainable output of the building after it's been built, but also by looking at the materials that go into a building. Like, are those materials sourced locally? Are those materials sustainable to produce, like wood versus concrete, that kind of stuff. So they're actually encouraging an adoption of stricter green building standards, and that in turn will positively impact their business, because if it's required to consider these elements in their building code for green buildings, then they in theory will get more business. Make sense? Might not apply to you, but just some ideas.
I think it's there, but I don't know if in Canada they have anything like this, but like diversity and inclusion, I think there's maybe some standards related to that, but
possibly
I'm not sure how strict they are.
Yeah. So like even if you're not able to directly influence those kind of things, having a voice and being a thought leader in the space and advocating for it can also put your company in a very favorable position for that as well.
I think it's something people want, but I think it's unfortunately not something that's really regulated. I could be mistaken, but I do know, like, the only one thing that I do notice, and it might not go related to this, but I think there are a lot of grants for hiring people that are focused on, like, oh, this grant is for someone who's BIPOC or whatever. So that could, of course, reduce the cost of the company if they can get candidates that align with that grant or funding.
Yeah, that's definitely a good approach. Like, that will help subsidize your fee, and it makes it a lot easier to get a customer to buy. Some other ideas around. I talked about referrals. If you haven't already, check out this book called Contagious. The author is Jonah Berger. I think the spelling in the caption is correct. And the full title of the book is Contagious: Why Things Catch On. And he talks about this framework called STEPS, STEPPS, in terms of elements that go into making something that is viral, that is good for referral. And I'll just quickly sum it up. But in a nutshell, the first S stands for social currency. When people think about sharing something, they want to think people are motivated to share because it makes them look good. So what are you doing that would help the person who is advocating for your product or service look good to others? Maybe they have exclusive information that nobody knows. Maybe it paints them in a positive light as someone that's very knowledgeable, or someone who cares about certain things. So what is that social currency? And then T is triggers. People will share when they remember to share. So what is the trigger that will get people to think about sharing your product or service? So do you associate with certain things? So for example, there's this lady here in Vancouver, and she does playfulness coaching for corporate employees, and she does it through Lego. So naturally, right away, you think about like, oh, if you're playing, you think of Lego, and then you think like, oh, I know someone who uses Lego to do corporate training and events. So what are the triggers? And then E is emotion. People are more likely to share not when they're content. So it's not just about positive emotions, but people are more engaged in speaking up when it's an arousing emotion. So arousing here means excitement, means funny, it means amusement. It could also mean things like frustration, complaint, that kind of stuff. So if it's highly charged emotionally, both positive or negative, people are more inclined to voice up. So if you ask people like, hey, tell me about that hiring experience you had, that will encourage people to talk as well. Versus like if you focus on just like, when were you last satisfied with your best hire? Like contentment is not a sharing emotion. And then PPS, I think 1P stands for public. If it's something that is easily visible, then it's gonna encourage sharing more often as well. So they were talking about Nike and their what was it? The Live Strong campaign with Lance Armstrong. And I think at the time they had those yellow bands that show that you support cancer. So certain activities, it's hard to manifest and show that you've done certain things. And it's hard to also communicate certain values as well. So how can you make those things public? Like, Movember, you're supporting cancer and you're showing it publicly by actually growing up your own stash. Same with those I voted badges as well. The other P is what was it? I think I don't remember what it stands for, but I think it's along the lines of like, what is the value that you give to the person that's receiving? Excuse me. Is how are you actually helping the person you're sharing? If you know that you're sharing this thing to someone and they get a discount, then that is a value that you're giving to someone, and therefore they are more likely to share as well. So you're not only thinking about the first one of social currency is what's in it for me, and then the other P, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's more about what's in it for them, for the receiver. And then the last S is there a story behind it? If you can wrap some sort of storytelling and it's not just a publicity stunt, again, those are things that are more likely to be spread.
Since it's public and something value, practical value,
Practical, yeah, I think practical.
which I think they must have just added the P so it fits, so it's not ST step viz.
Possibly.
Well, I mean, like what I think most value is probably practical and typically so.
Other ideas. So we talked about getting more customers. Other ideas that might spark something interesting is how can you get them to spend more when they do spend with you? So upselling, cross-selling. I think the difference. Upselling is basically selling a more expensive variant of the same thing. Basically, it's a bigger package. Cross-sell is you're giving other services that are related. Maybe for example, you might say like, oh, we help with building an onboarding program, and that's not part of your core program, right? That's more for website or retail. Like the more time a customer spends with you, the more likely they will spend more. Bundles, can you bundle anything? Maybe there are volume discounts. Maybe there's if they hire X number of people, they pay a more reduced price instead of going for the next tier of pricing. Yeah, but there are volume discounts, that kind of stuff. Cross-selling, if you ever get into a situation where you want this again, this is more future planning. The biggest pushback I typically get from sales reps is a lot of people feel uncomfortable selling something else when they just felt that they've convinced the customer to buy one thing. They feel like, oh, I've just convinced someone to buy this package. Now I need to try to get them to buy something else again. I don't feel comfortable doing that. And I think that is usually a fallacy because it happens if you feel that you're just doing a numbers game. But what you should be thinking instead is anything that I have to offer also going to help add value to the customer? If it helps them add value, then in theory, why not give it to them? Because they would want it. So for example, if you can say like, hey, I'm selling you a bike, and if we bundled it up with a helmet and a water bottle and a bottle holder, it's going to be at a cheaper price. Then most people will want those because they will want to get it anyways. So how can you help them win, right? Is it cheaper, more convenient, more value? So this example here is like, would you add breakfast for two? Normally 49, for just 29. It's better value, it's more convenient. Why wouldn't they say yes? The third one is increasing frequency of transactions. So how can you get them to come more often? Maybe it's in your case like seasonality, like during graduation there's a period of hiring. Right after summer there might be another period of hiring. So how can you take advantage of these seasons and go back to your clients and say, hey, you know what? Why don't we start a new campaign with you? That kind of stuff. So how can you stay top of mind? How can you build that habit with a customer? Maybe there are also loyalty programs. You could say like, oh, for every 5 hires you get, we run a free campaign for you, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so just thinking about different ideas that you can put in. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this. Quite a lot we went through. But any questions, any ideas?
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. I think we're currently at the stage of kind of going through this. A little bit it's tricky in terms of the timing, just because I'm trying to onboard a business developer probably next week. And so ideally they would have been onboarded at this point and we could discuss together the pricing and such. But at the moment it's kind of me deciding the pricing, but maybe
Well,
we'll
I've recorded the
adjust
session, so you can share it with them. I've recorded this session, so you can share this video with them.
Oh, no, I mean more like I'm deciding the pricing now, and it would be nice to decide the pricing together, but maybe I'll set the pricing and then over time we can discuss it with them and see how we adjust it. So
yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, because oftentimes what you set now is probably not going to be your fixed pricing for the rest of your business anyways.
No, I don't think so. And I mean, I'm happy to share with you, but I would prefer if it's not in the recording. It's up
Yeah,
to
sure.
you.
Actually, let me stop the recording.